All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian writes, "What is man and what is woman from a philosophical and practical position?" Well, this has become something of a famous question, thanks to Matt Walsh and his very interesting, funny, and in some cases very intensely angering documentary, What is a Woman? Bear in mind my warning about the documentary effects from last video. But it is a great documentary. And we can make jokes about the similarity to the Plato Diogenes question from 4th century Greece. What is man? It's a featherless biped. Diogenes comes in like Matt Walsh holding his plucked chicken. Behold the man. That stuff aside, let's get into the meat and potatoes here. This is a question about what is a man, what is a woman. This is fundamentally a question about identity. What does it mean for a thing to be itself, identical to itself? Identity, identical, Now, I apologize in advance. This is going to be a very jargon-heavy video here. I'll try to walk you through it as best I can, but there's no way around that. You're paying for or listening to philosophy, so I'm going to give you philosophy and at least some familiarity so you'll know what other people are talking about if you delve into this field. The field that studies identity in philosophy is called ontology. Ontology is, if you look it up online, it'll say it's the study of being, but that can be kind of misleading because being is a sort of ambiguous word. It's like studying what it's like to be? Not really. It's not studying bees either, or wasps. It's the best way to understand what ontology means is to look at examples of ontological arguments. Now, I go into ontology in some depth in Holy Nihilism, which I do recommend. It's not advocating nihilism. I titled that very badly, but I'm stuck with it now. So, But the two ontological arguments I will give as examples. First of all, if you hear the word "the ontological argument," the phrase, that's referring to the ontological argument for the existence of God, which says that you can know that God exists merely by understanding his nature. It sounds a little kooky on its surface, and in its original formulation it was not a good argument, but people didn't give up on it, and it has been reimagined and reforged a number of times, and in some of its modern formulations is actually quite powerful and quite compelling, interestingly. I would encourage people who are interested in that to look up Alvin Plantinga and his modal logic form. But the easier explanation to understand what people are even talking about when they talk about ontology is a much simpler ontological argument, and that comes from René Descartes. He made an ontological argument from triangles. He said that a triangle, first of all, is 3 points in space. That's what a triangle is. That's what it means for a triangle to be a triangle. So he does what all ontological arguments attempt to do, which is to deduce new conclusions, new information based solely on the nature of the thing, based solely on the ontology of the thing. The new information, the new conclusion that René Descartes arrived at was that the interior angles of a triangle all add up to 180 degrees. Now, that's not new information to anybody who studied geometry. You can try it out. But the idea that this conclusion could be arrived at from the nature of a triangle alone, without taking any measurements, was new, actually. And is a neat illustration of what people mean when they're making an ontological argument, or when they are talking about ontology. They're talking about the core nature of a thing, the essence, we might say, of a thing, which will lead us to another word in a minute. So, ontology, approaches to ontology, can be broken down into roughly two categories. If you look on Wikipedia, it'll say three. It's really two. And those two camps are idealism on one hand, and we don't mean having ideals, like aspirational ideals. What we mean is something closer to what you might call Platonic realism, which is the idea that identities and categories exist in their own right. In some cases, prior to the things being described. And both of these terms will exist on a gradient. I don't want to force any false binaries in here because there's a lot of gray area between the two. But the other broad approach behind idealism on the one hand is nominalism on the other. And nominalism is the idea that identities and categories come after individual things, that they are created or constructed by human beings like ourselves to describe the world. And again, if you imagine nominalism over here and idealism over here, there's some gray area. There are people who are like, who might call themselves conceptualists or something, where they're like, no, categories exist in our mind, as if that's different from nominalism, or idealism on the other hand. But then there are extreme versions of this. Like you could be an idealist who says no, individual things don't even exist at all. Only the categories are real. Or you could be an extreme nominalist and say any description of a category or an identity at all is not just a construct, but a philosophical mistake. That would be an extreme nominalist. So I bring this up as a kind of appetizer for the real binary. And it's a sort of misleading appetizer, but it's important to say because it's related to the topic and it's superficially similar. It's also useful to bring up to sort of preempt a mistake that people might be likely to make in conflating some things. Because when we talk about gender or sex, we have two very similar sounding terms to our idealism and nominalism, but they're in gender specifically, and those are, on the one hand, essentialism, and on the other hand, constructionism. Well, what is essentialism? Essentialism is the idea that genders are real categories, and like they exist prior to and outside our mind. And gender constructionism says that no, genders are constructs of the human mind, that they came after us. So already you can see there's a structural similarity between essentialism and idealism, and between nominalism and constructionism. So are all Platonic idealists, Platonic realists or idealists, going to be biological essentialists? Are all nominalists going to be gender constructionists? No, strangely enough. This might sound very counterintuitive, but if you think about it for a while, it becomes really clear. Suppose you are a gender essentialist. What is the ideal human male? Well, why are you asking the ideal human male instead of the ideal human? Right? Oh, well, we can go the other way too. Why the ideal human male and not the ideal European human male? Because surely there are some differences between different biological strains of humanity, and what's considered healthy in one case might not be. Sun exposure is an obvious one. And height or whatever. And we can make it even more refined. What is the ideal human male, European human male at age 30? And in a particular, and when you ask these kinds of questions, it reveals the sort of arbitrariness of settling on any any individual point in the chain of nested identities within a thing, which are inseparable from each other. You can't have a human male that isn't also a human being. You can't have a human being that isn't also a mammal, you know? And what is the ideal mammal without specifying which mammal is a nonsensical question. You know, well, like there's a lot of different mammals to choose from, and there's not one ideal that matches every mammal. So, you know, is there a Platonic form for a mammal? You know, is there a Platonic form for a human that isn't also nonsensical, given the variety of different contexts and strains of human males that you might run across? So you could be, this is not, this question, I think it's actually a fairly strong criticism of Platonic idealism in its own right, but it's not as if Neoplatonists haven't thought of this. You know, there's very little they haven't anticipated and thought about. But it raises a question that I brought up in another video some time ago about the transgender movement and genderqueer, and the question of dualism, which most people don't hold to, I don't think, but some people do believe that the soul is distinct from and apart from the body. And there's a question here: which part, if we were a dualist, which a Platonic idealist will be, and there's a human soul that's separate from the human body, which part does gender belong to? Is gender a part of our soul, or is it a part of our body? And it's not an easy question. You can't just assert it that, oh, it's clearly part of the body, or oh, it's clearly part of the soul. You have to think about it for a little while, and there are reasonable arguments you can make in both directions. But if we were to go back to some old texts, the Bible, for example, the tendency seems to be to view gender as a part of the body and not as a part of the soul. Again, opinions may vary on this. It's more of a question to think about, that, and just asking the question kind of raises its own problems, even if you think you come to an answer. But the Bible has this very famous passage, Galatians 3:8, a very, very abused passage, because they'll appropriate it into the domain of politics, as if the point of Christianity is to make utopia happen here on earth, which is not. But there's still something that Paul is trying to communicate in Galatians 3:8 when he says, you know, for in the Holy Spirit there is no free man or slave, no man or woman, but all are one in Christ. What is he saying with that? If not that, gender and, freedom status in politics or age or whatever are things of the earth and not things of the kingdom of heaven, not things of the spirit, which you are trying to be reborn into. So there are many reasons why all of this is to say, there are many reasons why a Platonic idealist might also be a gender constructionist, might hold that categories and identities can exist as a part of the soul, apart from the body, and also that gender is a social construct or a mental construct. Conversely, a nominalist, someone who believes that identities and categories are things we create to make sense of the world, not things that necessarily exist prior to us or independent. There are things, we give them names and categories to make our own lives easier. But it is also possible for a nominalist to believe that there are types and patterns and reasons for these types and patterns in the world as it exists prior to our experience of it, which our powers of perception and cognition don't permit us to fully grasp and understand. So our categories and descriptions and identities that we ascribe to things, useful as they may be, will always be necessarily imperfect, incomplete, and so forth. That's a nominalist position, more or less, I think. And a nominalist might say, gender, like the labels we create are constructed, but it's referring to patterns that are real. There are biological underpinnings here that are real, and the labels we create for them don't completely capture everything going on here, because how the biological realities express themselves in different contexts. I mean, different animals, right? There are many animal species where the female is larger than the male, and there are unique contextual reasons for that, just as there are reasons why in most mammals the male is larger than the female. And none of the imperfections of our categories like do anything to undermine the like essential patterns that run through the world, but they don't matter because we can't access them or whatever. So all of this is to say, someone could be a nominalist as far as our language is concerned, because that's what categories are. They're words, right? That we ascribe to things, and still believe there are real things underneath those categories, but there's an imperfection in the mapping. So you could be, in other words, a nominalist that is also a gender essentialist, because we don't equate the concept with the thing necessarily. And if you haven't gleaned this, I would consider myself somewhere in the nominalist but also gender essentialist camp. So I think it's important to point that out, because that is a trap that is easy to fall into in conflating idealism with essentialism and nominalism with constructionism. It's very often not the case, and more often than not actually reversed, strangely. So anyways, that complex philosophical nerdery out of the way, you can now pass your gender philosophy 101 class. Just remembering those terms, nominalism, ontology, identity, idealism, essentialism, constructionism. This would not be a complete talk about what is man, what is woman, without talking about biology. We're sort of out of the domain of philosophy proper, but it's an important thing here. Now, but it's important to bring up for the one more language binary pair, which is maybe the heart of the question. We'll see. And that is the difference between sex and gender. What's the relationship between those two? Well, what is sex? What is gender? Sex is fairly inarguable. I don't even think the most adamant progressives really contest sex. Sex is, do you have XX chromosome or XY chromosome? Do you have a penis or do you have a vagina? Sex is a biological category. But what they're talking about with gender, they say, is different. Now, if we're talking semantically, a gender is basically any category. It doesn't necessarily have to do with human beings at all. When we talk about genders in language, we are talking about grammatical categories. How do you conjugate a word? Is it masculine or feminine? There's a masculine conjugation and there's a feminine conjugation. Is it just a coincidence that we use the words masculine and feminine to describe these conjugation patterns and also to describe, male sex human beings and female sex human beings? No, it's not. No, it's not. And the reason it's not a coincidence is because language operates by association. And, we communicate by association. We communicate. That's what a word is. It's referring to one thing in terms of another thing. And we build associations. And since most of what human beings interact with is other human beings, which is the justification for language itself, it's natural that one of the things we're going to associate words with is, does it feel male or does it feel more female? I'm not a linguist. I can't back this up. This is sort of speculative here. But it seems natural to assume that certain words, just by their sound or who's using them or any number of things, and it's complicated because men and women have there's more than one dimension to what makes a man in our experience of him, and what maleness looks like will be different in different contexts. Same thing with female, and that doesn't mean that therefore we can't know anything about what a male is. This is one of the dangers, in fact, of idealism and Platonic realism. Again, idealism in the philosophical sense of the term. Words are very dangerous. But I think the great answer to this was written by my friend Jack Donovan in The Way of Men, which is addressing this exact question. Because masculinity is multifaceted and can mean different things, does that mean it doesn't mean anything at all? The answer is clearly no. It does mean something. And this is because, a single thing can express itself in many different ways in different contexts. A snowshoe hare that is white in winter and, grayish brown in summer is not like a different animal because it acts differently in different contexts. And in fact, we can triangulate that the nature of masculinity in some ways actually better by looking at it in multiple contexts, and we can get a more refined sense of what masculinity means by seeing it in many different places, in many different ways. And same with femininity, but it's much harder to express simply in language. And again, the danger of language is going to be a persistent theme of not just this video, but some other projects coming out in the near future. So it's not a coincidence that gender in grammar sort of coincides with the gender associations of sex in human animals. But what this means is that the gender categories in grammar, in language, reflect some quality of maleness or femaleness that we experience. So we can say very loosely, and again, there's a danger in too much definition work here, but we can say loosely that gender, as we're talking about with man and woman, is the quality of likeness to biological sex. What it is like. Is it like what a man is like? Is it like what a female is like? And male and female in the sex sense, not the gender sense. Or because if it's only referring to masculine and feminine in the gender sense, then the whole thing's circular and falls apart. So, what is the relationship then between gender and sex? Well, there's a clear comparison, but as we've already described, men and women happen to share the same taxonomical space on our animal kingdom chart. We are the same species. And so we're going to be similar in a lot of ways. We're going to share a lot of things. We share 99.99 whatever percent of genetic code. So there's going to be overlapping bell curves. That little bit of difference, which is very, very important in our day-to-day lives, we experience it as being very, very important. You'd maybe experience it as less important if you were married to a chimp. What we end up seeing are imperfect patterns and tendencies, but that differentiate males and females, men and women. And we have to be satisfied with the imperfections of our and the incompleteness of our descriptions of these patterns if we're going to get anywhere in differentiating males and females. Because you're going to be really dissatisfied if you think because there are exceptions, therefore men and women are identical. Some people try to make that argument. there are also similarities between human beings and bananas, genetically speaking. But I wouldn't. Well, I guess you can have some fun with a banana, but probably wouldn't make a good long-term life partner. But to bring it back a little bit to the qualities of maleness and the qualities of femaleness, what is usually expressed in these patterns when we talk about masculine and feminine is not just general tendencies, although that can sometimes be true too, but it's very often idealized tendencies. And this is something that Jack brings up very masterfully in The Way of Men, because he defines masculinity, our experience of something as being masculine, specifically of a person, of a man as being masculine, according to the degree to which he has the four tactical virtues, which are strength, courage, mastery, and honor. There are many, many virtues out there that are not strength, courage, mastery, and honor. That are what we might call androgynous virtues. Say honesty. Honesty is a virtue, but it's not distinctive of men. It doesn't distinguish men from women. Strength is a virtue in women, right? But a woman will not be considered deficient in femininity if she is weak, right? Just as a man might not be considered deficient in masculinity if he isn't honest. He's still a more virtuous person if he's honest, but he's not less of a man. He's not less masculine, because we see very many masculine villains in like films and stories and stuff. There's many bandits and thieves and other dishonest people who are like, ooh, we don't like that person, but they are a very masculine dude. We feel viscerally we feel their gender identity. I'm using leftist language now. Through these virtues, even in the absence of other virtues. I mean, you talk about like Darth Vader or whatever. So, if there are certain virtues that are defining of our experience of something as being like a male, that gives us a framework to think about, not something merely descriptive, although it is descriptive of what we look to and lean towards, but also because it's something that we lean towards and recognize in others, something that we can, after describing it, aspire to and improve in ourselves. It's what makes us these gender roles, because they describe what we look to as the maximum points on masculinity and femininity, are also, by their nature, kind of roadmaps, can become guiding stars to become more of that if we are deficient in it. I have a joke I've told a few friends that the ideal, the like most masculine guy is going to be a like special operations soldier. So what's the female equivalent of that? And the joke is the female equivalent of that is a stripper. Very feminine, very beautiful, very charming, and so forth. And I always get a kick out of telling special forces friends and acquaintances this, because they take it as a compliment. Oh, we're the strippers of men. And there's a subtle inside joke about the tendency for certain kinds of SF guys to wind up marrying strippers, which is always a problem. But anyways, it also might be an illustration of the while we can admire what SF guys and strippers achieve in terms of dangerous competence and beauty and sensuality, you might not want to emulate that. You might not want the alcoholism and depression and PTSD and back injuries and leg injuries and all that stuff. You might not want the stripper life either, it's like a philosophy joke of sorts. But again, like these high points of achievement can guide us in the direction of being more like something without going all the way and becoming extreme. You know, you can be inspired by David Goggins without becoming David Goggins, sort of thing. So that, I think, leads us, we've been going on for a while about the philosophy of gender and identity and ontology, and what does it mean for a thing to be itself. And I think what we've arrived at, hopefully through this discussion, is that what it means to be a man is to be like a biological male, and specifically to be like the idealized, like a biological male in terms of the virtues that are idealized in others in relation to the thing. And we can look at this in language. And again, this can be tricky. This can be tricky because the genders have different expressions, different places, which is why it's not like mysterious or strange that the Germans would conjugate the sun as feminine and the Spanish would conjugate it as masculine. It's like, oh, of course, there are ways in which we can say the sun is masculine, and there's ways in which we can say the sun is feminine. I tend more towards the Spanish side on this one. But this kind of leads us to some the practical side, because Ian also asked, not just from a philosophical position, but also from a practical position. What is man and what is woman? And the world of practical advice can be kind of a dangerous place, kind of a very easy place to get misled. I'm going to talk about this from a dating frame and a marriage frame, because that's where most of our meaningful interactions with the opposite sex are. It's with our, spouses or girlfriends, boyfriends, or whatever. And here, so much of what you'll see online is directionally correct for men in a particular place or women in a particular place, but can be very misleading if taken at face value. One of the things Ian sent me in conjunction with the question was a video by Elisha Long, and his what he calls it, his like rule 1 of women. And it's he says a lot of things in that video that I would never say as advice to other people, but the core of what he's trying to say is the best way to be as a man around other women is to be what pickup artists call outcome independent. To kind of have a zero fucks given energy. To be able to, if she says something critical to you, you don't get offended by it. You're just like kind of roll with it, and nothing seems to faze you. And for many men who are struggling with women, they're trying to talk with women the way that they would talk with a man, and it doesn't work, and they keep weirding people out, and they keep whatever. That kind of advice can be very, very good. But it's not absolute. It's very helpful, for example, if you're talking to a woman who is in a flirty kind of dating mode. They're like looking for someone. They're just trying to have a good time out with some friends, maybe talk to a guy, who knows. If you are a man and you are being really clingy and really like anxious and unsure about things, like that's going to turn them off, right? If you act outcome independent in a crisis, many women will drop you in a heartbeat. Because it really matters. It really matters there. If your wife is really anxious about money, because ask me how I know. And if you treat that as a joke, if you just try to do the RSD, like just go on vibes thing, that's not correct. Because it turns out women are not only flirty maidens. They are also young girls. They are also old women. They are people with their own interests and curiosities, that like connection that isn't just sexual. They have their own fears and anxieties and hopes and so forth. And you need to take in all of the advice that people like Elisha Long, and I will say I learned a lot from pickup artists. I think they were the best social scientists of the 2010s, far better than anything coming out of academia. And they have a lot of good advice to give. But you have to keep it in perspective. You have to remember that while the things that they are saying are true and useful in many cases, they're not always true. And there's an art in application. And the best practical advice, and this comes straight from the pickup artist, is talk with more women. Just get out there and talk more with people. And because this is not about just girls. This is not just about dating even. It's about understanding people. It's about understanding men and women as categories, what unites us, what separates us. If you want to understand more about these kinds of things, you have to get out there and experience more. Talk with strangers. Talk with hobos. Talk with bartenders. Talk with gas station attendants. Talk with coworkers, your boss, your aunts and uncles, your parents, your kids, your wife's friends. Maybe don't do that. Get out there and experience more. Because insofar as understandings of gender and differences in sex are valid, they are descriptive. I think that's the great virtue of the way of men, is it is descriptive. Meaning, but if a description of a category is descriptive, that means it's describing what already exists. That's what a descriptive conceptualization means. That's what it means for it to be descriptive. So the only way to check your understanding of these sorts of things is to get out there and see for yourself. And it also means, sort of tangentially to that the best way to become more masculine or feminine, depending on if you're a man or a woman, or to just be better in general, is to be healthy and to learn to follow and listen to your body, and just be the best version of yourself. And what if you are a man, what you express from the best version of yourself will sort of almost definitionally be masculine. Which is not to say there can't be a continuum from men and what men recognize in each other, and we rank each other and all that. But it's very easy to fall into sort of esoteric rabbit holes. And I think it's good to say that there's a kind of genre confusion when reading sort of esoteric oversimplifications of broad and complicated categories. There's a line from Friedrich Nietzsche, for example. I don't remember which book it's from, but it might be The Gay Science, where he says, man is will, woman is willing. So it's very wise, very informative. But what does that mean? It's the sort of thing. It's the sort of saying that will be very profound and feel to capture something essentially true and valuable to someone who already understands it, but will be profoundly misleading and guiding people on a very wrong path if you're some 21-year-old and you think because you heard this Nietzschean line you now understand the nature of men and women. No, you don't. The same is true of the much crasser, like, man is a key, women is a lock kind of thing. You're not getting any knowledge about the nature of man and the nature of woman from these kinds of esoteric, oversimplifying bits of pseudo-wisdom. I'll offer my own just for fun. I would say woman is a security-seeking animal, and man is a security-providing animal. Is this true? Well, I think essentially yes, but is it always true? Does this mean that women don't want adventure sometimes? Don't want a little risk? Of course it doesn't mean that. Women love adventure. Now maybe it means they want adventure because they want to viscerally feel their security. It's not real if they don't test it sometimes. Maybe. Or maybe they just like adventure because it's fun. My own little esoteric pseudo-wisdom should not be taken any more seriously than anyone else's. And this doesn't mean it isn't true. I actually believe what I said there. I just don't think anyone else is going to get that much value out of it. The best way to think of these kinds of oversimplifications, and this is probably true of Elisha Long's video as well, is that think of these lines less as wisdom, less as attempts to pass valuable knowledge onto someone else, and more as poetry, more as something you say that is valuable intrinsically to say it in your own way. Maybe it's a new, useful frame. It might be valuable to some people who are in a particular place and they need to hear exactly that thing at exactly that time, but probably not you. And if you view it as poetry, which I think it is, it's you can appreciate it, and maybe one day you'll be like, oh, I get what they were saying, and you can connect with that person. It's useful in its own way. But as far as understanding men and women, the closest thing you're going to get to a universally useful bit of oversimplified wisdom as far as relating to the opposite gender is the pickup artist thing about outcome independence. But even that is directional and limited in scope. The best way is to really get out there and experience things yourself. So I guess to conclude and to give my thoughts about like what is man and what is woman, they are absolutely real categories, and the sex part of this is very obvious. It's man has a penis, XY chromosome. Woman has vagina, breasts is XX chromosome. As far as male and female as genders, if we accept that distinction, and James Lindsay makes I think a reasonably compelling, or at the very least interesting argument that we shouldn't even be making those distinctions. As Jordan Peterson says the overlap between masculine and male is like 99.9% or whatever, and feminine and female. He says masculine and feminine refer to personality, not to biology. But like talking about these categories in the abstract is not wisdom. It can let me explain what I mean by that. If we get talked into dismissing the male-female distinction, if we get talked into that by some academic saying, as I was presented when I went to college, look, here's a picture of a man and a picture of a woman with equally tight, short haircuts, and they're in a similar skin suit. A lot of the defining features that we associate culturally with male and female have been eradicated from this artificial, photo of men we've put in and women we've put in identical outfits. Therefore, masculinity and femininity don't exist. That's just brain rot, right? That's just willing the destruction of the world as is for whatever reason. But it's you don't want to get taken in by that stuff. But overcoming that is like that gets you to ground zero. That gets you up from the basement and garage floor to the ground, but you've still got a ways to go up. You've got all the world in front of you as far as how to practically navigate what is the meaning of the difference between man and woman? How do I act upon that in the world? And there are certain aspects of that if you ignore, you are going to set yourself up for serious trouble because of the biological underpinnings of reality. Like if you are a man and you think that you can just be friends with women in the same way that you can be friends with men, you're going to wind up in trouble. If you're healthy, especially if you're married, that is going to go poorly. 8 times out of 10. Maybe you're one of the lucky ones, probably not. Especially if you get really healthy and fit and wealthy. You'll end up like Jeff Bezos or one of these other guys who ends up, divorced and breaking apart your family. Dave Grohl recently, I guess. But these so we can use philosophy and a proper understanding of these categories to combat the brain rot. But we have to be very careful because the oversimplifications that we can fall into in either direction can mislead us, not only in relation to other people but also in relationship to ourselves. And I think a good example of this is that many men who become enamored with Stoicism come to think that like men shouldn't feel. First of all, that's just self-delusional. Men have feelings, and if you think that you don't have time for feelings or whatever, you haven't overcome the biological reality of your emotions. You've just pushed them down to somewhere below your own level of consciousness, and they're going to do destructive things in your life. So you don't. These oversimplifications have their own danger, and the best way to move past that and to overcome that is to not be taken in by them in the first place. To say, I need to go experience some things. I need to talk with more people, have some life experiences, begin to get a sense from your own experiences of the patterns in the world. And it is sometimes useful to have some linguistic priming. Say, do the tactical virtues actually describe men or masculinity? Not certainly masculinity doesn't describe all men, just as femininity doesn't describe all women. But it does describe what we find most attractive in men and women as friends, as family members. We want our family to be like awesome, right? So the best way to really go about this, aside from just having life experiences, is to improve your health. Improve your health. A lot of masculinity seems to just be the expression of testosterone. And there's a connection there with health generally. But improving your health and becoming better, becoming more valuable to other people, because that's what these gender roles are. They are what is most valuable in men or in women to other people. And I think a lot of the motivation to flee from or reject or rebel against gender roles is a rebellion against the oppression of other people. It's a rebellion against the feeling of control that we feel other people have over us and the desire to break from that. And I can empathize with that, honestly. The only downside is if you go down that path, you just wind up lonely, which is even worse. If you had to choose to be, an unfairly treated servant, perhaps we could say a slave, and once upon a time, or totally alone, I think there's a tendency for idealistic young men. I think we could use idealistic in both senses here, to say, I would rather be not just alone, but dead than a slave. And that is, in its own way admirable, especially admirable in a 20-year-old. I think less so in a 30-year-old. But I don't think that's descriptive. I think we actually like the company of other people. I think, as Plato says, it would either be a god or a beast who could truly live alone. And you're not a god. Sorry. We live for other people. And the solution to being around bad people is not to be alone. It's to find better people. And the best way to do that is to be more valuable, to be better, to be more of what other people want from another person. And that often means being more masculine as a man, being more feminine as a woman. It increases the scope of your options. It increases the possibilities, and it increases, hopefully, the quality of the people you can spend time with, which is what's going to determine the quality of your life, because what other people are what we really live for at the end of the day. So, sort of a little bit beyond the what is a man and what is a woman from a philosophical position, but it is hard to talk about man and woman without referring to each other, because we are symbiotic entities. We exist in relationship to each other, and it ties in both philosophically and practically. So anyways, I hope this was informative and interesting. It was a little bit long, apologies for that, but thanks for sitting through it. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.